meeting would be to raise awareness among ministers of the challenges of the WASH targets of the SDGs and the changes required to meet them. They will also follow up on the discussions that took place in Addis Ababa, where building blocks of a strong sector were discussed. And you might recall that these building blocks on the sector relate to having a policy and plan that responds to the needs of the Sustainable Development Goals, having financing and institutions that are fit for purpose, having capacity, as well as having a process of review and planning that captures information and is able to utilize that information well. So the ministers will take that discussion further by looking into some of the building blocks and figuring out what other countries are doing in those building blocks, but also being able to discuss whether the building blocks are fit for purpose or if there are some changes that need to be made. The other objective for the meeting will be to enable ministers and senior representatives of development partners to discuss the essential collaborative behaviors that foster increased development effectiveness. Again, these collaborative behaviors focusing more on how to enhance government leadership of the sector, using and developing and using country systems, as well as having a platform for accountability and for review, a platform that uses data and information so that the data and information can drive decision making in the sector. And then ministers will also discuss attracting and utilizing adequate financing in advance of the finance ministers meeting. So this will create, in a way, a line of sight between the sector ministers and the finance ministers meeting. Now, in addition to that, they will also, in terms of the anticipated outcomes of the meeting, is that there would be an agreement on follow-up action by SWA partners at country level that reflect the key foundational elements and behaviors discussed at the meeting, and also the shared understanding and agreement on a framework for action for the sector that includes an articulation of both the building blocks and the collaborative behaviors. Now, a critical point here is that the meeting themselves are only a moment at which sector partners come together, particularly ministers, to raise attention to the sector. But the anticipated outcomes of the sector ministers meeting are things that can be carried on at country level. And therefore, the follow-up becomes very critical, as well as the country processes and actions become very critical in that process. So at this time, maybe I should also just include a few aspects from the finance ministers meeting, and then we can take questions together. In terms of the finance ministers meeting, and like I said, the sector ministers meeting is anticipated to take place. It's planned to be a day and a half, and then it's obviously for 1 to 2 ministers per country. Two ministers if the water and sanitation functions are handled by different ministries, and each minister can bring 1 staff member. So Cameron, I hope this is able to respond to the question that you had. A small number of representatives from each constituencies in terms of the civil society or private sector and research and learning will also be present at the meeting. So in terms of the indicative agenda of that meeting, so one key aspect of the agenda would be to review and go through learning in terms of the challenge of reaching the SDGs. So some discussions on the coverage and equity on development effectiveness and building blocks, as well as the way forward in terms of how to utilize joint sector reviews and accountability, private sector, and also some case studies in a few places. And then there will be ministerial dialogues. So those who were in Addis Ababa, what we learned is that ministers like these moments when they're able to sit together with other ministers and go through some of the issues that are critical to them, issues of concern to them. So there will be 3 ministerial dialogues that are currently being discussed in terms of what exactly they're going to look at. But these will be looking at inherent challenges of the SDGs. And then at the end of the meeting, the idea is to have a keynote speaker who would bring in, who would reinforce the message on financing and also make some conclusions, but also create the link with the finance ministers meeting. So that is some rough ideas in terms of the agenda that is being planned for the sector ministers meeting. So in terms of the finance ministers meeting, that's obviously for finance ministers and some of their sector ministers who will accompany them in Washington, D.C. It's taking place at the World Bank. Discussions have progressed in terms of the World Bank convening this meeting and making it a part of the spring meeting so that it is in the formal agenda. And we hope that that can help mobilize finance ministers to be able to attend this meeting as well. The timing that is being discussed now is roughly 1 hour 30 minutes to 2 hours. So that's going to be a tight time slot, but we're hoping that there can be sufficient information covered in the time. And then the focus again being on financing universal access through a mix of efficiency gains and additional financing sources. And that the in-country preparatory dialogue now going up to the meeting should be able to help in terms of getting finance ministers up to speed with some of the challenges that the sector already is facing. So this is the plan in terms of the finance ministers meeting, that the focus is on 3 issues. One, what's the magnitude of the challenge? What do the SDGs really mean for the sector? That's the basic question around this issue of estimating the magnitude of the challenge. And then within there, what's the financing gap? And if there is a discussion about the financing gap, then the idea is that it can be looked at from 2 angles. How closing the financing gap by using existing resources more effectively, and then closing that financing gap by accessing new resources for the sector. And these 2 things are part of what we're going to discuss shortly in this webinar this evening. So the hope is that finance ministers will really get to grips with these issues of what the financing gap is, or rather what the investments are, in the needed investments for the sector, what the funding gap is, and then how do you close that funding gap using existing resources as well as accessing additional financing. So that's about the 2 meetings. And just in case there are any questions at this point, let me pause and get any questions that are there. So Fiona, if you could just let me know if there are questions that you were able to keep track of. I will go quickly in the chat as well to check.
Sure, Satali. So we have one question from Kamran. Would the framework of actions and the follow-up actions be formally agreed upon at the HLM?
Okay, so on the framework for action, at the steering committee in December, there were discussions of how this framework for action would look like. Again, it centers around the building blocks, the collaborative behaviors, and having multi-stakeholder discussions in country that reinforce that ongoing conversation on sector development and catalyzing sector action towards progress for the Sustainable Development Goals. At the moment, there are countries that discussing with the Secretariat and with partners of SWA in terms of doing some case studies of trying that out. How exactly does it look in practice, and how can you utilize existing processes to be able to do that, and what do you need, what factors really contribute to that in terms of leadership, in terms of coordination. So the hope is that there could be some insights that would come out from this process, but again, it is too early to say that they would be finalized by the time of the high-level meeting, but hopefully that there would be some insights that would come from there. And our hope is that by the time of the meeting there could be some lessons that can be shared, but understanding that this is an ongoing process. I think that what the meeting will aim at doing is to create a strong realization that the meeting itself is just a moment in time, but then having these strong country processes that keep on going at country level would be much stronger, and getting ministers to appreciate that will be the spirit of the discussion. So I hope that answers your question, Cameron. Do we have any other question? And please do feel free, if you have a mic that is working, do feel free to be able to pick up and ask any question that you might have. Okay, thank you. So that's good to know, Kamran, that Pakistan would like to be involved in that process. I think Irfan might have indicated, might have responded to an email that Katarina sent around. So we'll check again in terms of Pakistani's positioning in that process, and it's really good to know about that SACOSAN process, because one of the other potential areas is also how to link with the regional activities. I think there was somebody who wanted to say something.
Hey, this is Lajna here. Now I'm wondering, like, the work on case studies have started.
Oh,
Do you have any idea on that?
Yes, the work on case studies, I would say that it's eminently going to start. It hasn't started yet. What is going on now is a discussion on what the case studies could look at, what the methodologies, or ideas about the methodologies. So there's still that sort of final stages of doing that. There have also been discussions with various colleagues from different countries in terms of talking to government, but also talking to partners to see what the partners could support in that process. So that stage that process is being led by the Country Processes Working Group, and our understanding is that it is in sort of the final stages of that discussion, but I can't say that it. I think in some countries, like Zimbabwe, where they were thinking of utilizing a consultant, they might have started in terms of thinking of who the consultant is, but I don't think that they have already hired the consultant, for example. Thank you.
So how many, Talia, how many case studies they are planning for?
Okay, so the plan.
Or how many case studies?
The plan was to have about 6 case studies. I think now there are potentially 8 case studies, if not even 9. And the idea is not that there's a specific closure in terms of the number, but they were just trying to see where there is already interest from the government and matching that with our partners' interest in doing that. I think that if there were additional countries that were to come up, that discussion can be had with the Country Processes Working Group. And by all means, the process is not to close the list of countries where the case studies are happening. If a country wants to do something, by all means, the country can go ahead. And in any case, it is really sort of this just documenting this process, which is partly around the preparations for the HLM, but also linking that to even activities post the HLM. So I hope that responds to your question, Lajana. And for now, I would just move very quickly into into the preparatory process, which I believe most of us have received the guidance note that we sent a few weeks ago. If you haven't received that guidance note, if this is strange to you, please do let us know. Then Fiona and Balvant and myself will get to that. So for most of the colleagues in this region, you've been also been in correspondence with our colleague Balvant in terms of contributing to the preparatory process. What we've suggested, just in terms of summary for the preparatory process, is that countries use the ongoing discussions and dialogues to do analysis on the SDGs, and out of that analysis develop specific briefs for ministers. These would fit what each of the ministers that you're talking to would be expecting, but that information that goes to ministers be supported by a country overview. That country overview, in terms of format, we were suggesting that it could look at 4 things. One is the synthesis on the SDGs. What's the country's SDG vision, and what's the country's baseline estimates for the SDGs? That gives the idea of the scale in terms of where the country wants to go. And then look at this, the sector readiness, or rather how fit is the sector to actually catalyze progress towards the SDGs. And the suggestion here was to look at 2 things. On one hand, what are the things that are required for a well-functioning sector? So the policies, the plans, the institutions, financing, as well as the capacity. And looking at those building blocks and seeing whether they are actually responding to what the SDGs are requesting. And that's one part of this sector readiness. The second part of the sector readiness is looking at the ways of working around how partners and government are enhancing the government's leadership to be able to deliver. Ways of working in terms of utilizing country systems, and where those country systems are not existent, how to actually support their development and strengthen them. And it could be country systems for procurement, for financial management, and just realizing that using these country systems is really very key in terms of strengthening even sustainability and strengthening the country's ability to manage services. And then also looking at the use of existing platforms for accountability and using information in decision making. So these 2 parts of sector readiness, building blocks and collaborative behaviors, are very key in terms of that country overview. But you will also see that they come through in the agenda for the SMM, and that is why we're suggesting that it's important that this country overview should cover those. And then the third part of this country overview was going to be the financial analysis. Basically, what are the investments that are needed for the sector to achieve the SDGs, and what's the financing gap? We are suggesting here, if a country already has a sector investment plan that is SDG focused, is over the horizon of the next 12, 13 years in terms of going up to the SDGs, countries can use information from that from that sector investment plan. We're hearing that Myanmar, for example, already has such a sector investment plan. However, if a country doesn't have such a sector investment plan, we were suggesting that countries could utilize the costing tool, which was also circulated by email, to calculate these investment plans. So that information could come through countries could use the costing tool to do the projections in terms of the investment needs and the funding gap. So countries could use information that they have from the existing investment plans, or utilize the tool where it was deemed useful to actually have that tool. And then the final part of this country overview was on the planned actions, which again we're thinking could tease out some of those immediate actions that the country wants to take. So for example, a country would say, we think we've got an idea from the costing tool roughly what our investment needs are. We will therefore go and design and develop a sector financing strategy, which looks at how we're going to use existing resources better and attract additional financing. So that could be an action that goes into the last component of this country overview. And then at the global level, we've had the webinars, and we're also asking for bilateral calls that we can have with countries. There's also the guidance note that we sent around, and there's input that's coming in, an input paper that has been worked on by UNICEF and the World Bank, and we should be sending that out. And this input paper basically explains much more the discussion that we're having today in terms of the how to use existing resources better and attracting additional financing. The JMP team are working on the baseline estimates that they've received from different countries, and they will be sending these back to countries for validation, and at that point it will be possible to actually to pick some of that data and utilize it for the country overview. The GLASS team is also working on the SWA Collaborative Profiles that I will talk about in a few minutes, which could be utilized to discuss a part of this sector readiness. And then towards the meeting, there'll be a GLASS report, and then the sector ministers meeting and the finance ministers meeting. So this is roughly what was discussed in terms of the preparatory process, and please do feel free to put in questions in the chat if there are any questions there. And I was going to go quickly to the collaborative behaviors profiles, because in the webinars that we've had, the first, second, and third webinar, we just talked about collaborative behaviors, what they are, and at some point some of the indicators, but now I just wanted to share a little bit about this information about the country profiles. And you will recall, I'm sure you've seen this several times, that the collaborative behaviors are primarily around four things: how to enhance government leadership of sector planning processes, how to strengthen and use country systems, and then using an information and mutual accountability platform, as well as building sustainable water and sanitation sector financing strategies. So these the behaviors came out of research in about 10 countries looking at development effectiveness practices, and those four were what were agreed within the sector as being very fundamental to how progress can be driven within the sector. And in the course of last year, there was a discussion on how to measure those or those collaborative behaviors, or rather, what are the indicators that show that there is progress in these areas. So the Global Monitoring Harmonization Working Group of SWA, as well as the Country Processes Working Group, which comprises people from different constituencies, including countries, external support agencies, as well as other research and learning partners, were able to come together and put together a package in terms of how the indicators are and how to collect information to develop a country profile. So the process was consultative, it was open, and there were 5 country profiles that were developed as proof of concept ahead of the ministers' meeting in Addis Ababa. And based on feedback on those country profiles, and now a new wave of country profiles will be being worked on, with the plan of having those circulated to countries as they become ready in the coming weeks, with the hope that when countries receive these country profiles, they could use them to have discussions around development effectiveness, and hopefully develop some intermediate, or rather agree some intermediate steps that the government and partners want to take to strengthen the application of these collaborative behaviors. So for example, it might be that a country looks at their profile, and their profile shows that the use of country systems is still nascent, it's weak, and therefore a country would agree that in the next year or so, we hope that partners will be able to use country systems and align fully with the government's country systems. So I'm just going through quickly this slide because I think I've covered most of what it's talking about. And maybe one thing to mention is that when the country profiles are received, they will have indicators both for government. They will have information both in terms of how governments are applying the collaborative behaviors and how development partners are applying the collaborative behaviors. So it actually helps to have a conversation both on the side of government and the side of cooperating partners, but also have a joint discussion in terms of what some of the intermediate actions might be. And the development of the country profiles is actually relying a lot on already existing data. So the recent GLASS survey, there's a lot of information coming from the GLASS surveys. There's a lot of information coming from OECD and as well as the CPIA of the World Bank and the Public Expenditure Framework for Accountability, which also brings out a lot of information on the use of financial management systems, as well as auditing and budgeting information. So that the country profiles really rely on already existing information, and countries would be good to have a conversation on that, or on their country, on their profile. But in case there are any questions in terms of the data itself, we just wanted to stress that that data is a data that in most cases has already been agreed in one way or the other by partners within that country. That's just a sample in terms of how the collaborative behaviors country profiles would look like. But I'm not sure that you'd be able to see that. So it would have information on each of the 4 behaviors, behavior 1, 2, 3, and 4. So roughly coming to about a 4-page document that would be sent to countries. And again, just in terms of an example of how the profile could be used, the country could look, for example, at strengthening and using country systems and see that in terms of the scoring, they've done quite well, but there's still some way to go, and that could be in terms of using procurement procedures. So the actions that could come out of those discussions, for example, the government will make procurement procedures more transparent, and development partners will progressively increase the use of these systems. It could be on financing, for example, that government will develop a financing strategy which takes into consideration the 3 T's. So it might be that maybe the current financial strategy only deals with 1 or 2 of these 3 T's, the tariffs, transfers, or taxes, but maybe the discussion in country would be that we want to look more also at one of the other areas that have not been looked at, and developing action out of that. So this is just an example in terms of how the country profile could be used, and this information can already contribute to the country overview. That is then given to the minister ahead of the meeting. So at this point, let me pause again for questions before we get to the final sets, to the final parts of the slides that we have for today. Do we have any questions? Is there anybody who would like to jump in and offer some comments or remarks at this point? So it looks like we have one question. When would we be able to know the exact date and time and venue of finance ministers meeting? Okay, so in terms of the actual dates, so we know for sure that the UNICEF is going ahead in terms of, UNICEF is the convener of the sector ministers meeting. So the dates of the sector ministers meeting will be Wednesday and Thursday, the 19th and 20th of April. There've been discussions, as some just yesterday, Monday, with the World Bank. They're waiting to receive the entire agenda for the spring meetings, because the spring meetings, because the high-level meeting, the finance ministers meeting, is actually situated within the spring meetings in the formal agenda. They're putting it within the formal agenda. They're making efforts to have it in the formal agenda. And they would like to be sure that they're picking a slot where the competition for the attention of the ministers is somewhat managed properly. So it is likely that that meeting would be on the Thursday, which is the 20th. There's also a chance that it might be on that Friday morning, the 21st. But in terms of discussion with sector ministers, who we know should be working to get visas to go to Washington, to get permission from prime ministers to or presidents to travel, the for the sector ministers meeting are now clear, and that would be the 19th and 20th. For the finance ministers, most likely the 20th. There's a chance it might be on the 21st, but we're waiting to receive the final go-ahead from the World Bank. So that was in response to the question from Cameron. Tanya, I think, let me just read this about the country profile framework. Seems very comprehensive and will be a big eye-opener for the sector if properly filled in, and the basis for enhance. Thank you so much for that, Tanya. And in fact, the country profile will already be developed. So when it is received, it will be received with the information on each of the behaviors in such a way that it would just enable the conversation at country level to start. So hopefully that can help trigger the conversation. Okay, when is GLAS and JMP sharing the information? So the information from the country profiles, or rather the country profiles themselves, these will be trickling in within the coming weeks as soon as the team finishes a batch of the country profiles. They will start sending them out. So we will not send all of them all at once, but we'll send them as soon as we receive those that are finalized. And then the JMP, I was talking to Tom Slaymaker on Friday. He informed me that they sending this the baseline data for validation in the coming week or so. So hopefully within the next week, this information should be in country. If not, I know for sure that by about the 20th or so, that information should be sent. But as well, when we are sure from their side also which ones they've sent, we can always communicate with our respective country focal points on that. Okay, Lajana, you're asking, just wondering if the countries have been updating their profiles. So the profiles, the first 5 that were done last year were the first ones. And the way this is working is that the team at GLAS is mining through the data that is already existing and using that data to develop the profile and sending it to the country so that the country could then have the discussions that they want to have. So what gets to the country is more or less a finished product, but it is also a product which is an input for their discussions. So it is a product that comes having already been developed out of the existing information, but then it helps the countries to actually have a conversation on where they think their application of the behaviors really are. And so that helps to trigger the conversation. Okay, Tanya, in terms of what you're saying, I think when the country profile has been received at country level, I think that should be able to trigger that discussion. I think what is a bit difficult up to this point is that the data which is being utilized is already existing data. So, for example, most countries have just gone through filling in the GLAS survey. And it is that same information which they used, which they discussed and had a lot of debate on at country level, which is being utilized to develop the country profile. So when they receive the country profile, it is in a way a reflection of the information that they would have already had a discussion on, because it is utilizing these various pieces of information. And then Cameron, HLM in spring meetings schedule is a great news. It should be communicated further to all partners as this will help in. Yes, so Cameron, what we're just waiting is more or less the final go ahead from the World Bank. what we know for sure is that from the very high level within the global water practice, they are working to get this onto the spring meetings agenda, and that is why, as of today, they can't just say it's going to be Thursday or Friday, because they want to be sure that they're corroborating that with their colleagues working on the spring agenda. Okay, and then Lalit, it's good to know sort of those discussions that are going on at country level in terms of the preparatory process. And like we indicated, we're happy to also pick some of that information up within bilateral discussions, bilateral call, or even if you wanted, we could arrange something also differently for each country. We're really keen to just get a sense of what countries are doing, and also if a country is planning, for example, to use the SDG costing tool, we're really keen to make sure that we're linking that up with the existing support, the global help desk, for example, that is in place to support that process. So I will move on now to talk about the financing component, and hopefully we can use the remaining time to discuss that. So the presentation on the financing component should have been made by colleagues from the World Bank, but our colleague Dominic, who should have done this, is just traveling now back to London from the meeting that we had in New York with the World Bank and UNICEF, as well as with the chair of SWA, Mr. Kevin Rudd, in terms of planning for the meeting. So he requested that if I could go through these slides. And again, you will notice that the slide we have now showing is predominantly one that you might have seen already, just presented differently. So what are the three themes that finance ministers are looking at? So one is understanding the challenge on the SDGs. One is how can they make existing resources work better? How can they make more efficient and effective use of existing financial resources? And then how can they also look at additional financing? And then the hope is that this could help contribute in terms of defining a financing strategy for the SDGs. So a financing strategy that combines two things, using the existing resources in a much more efficient way, and then looking at options for additional financing and how to crowd those in, how to bring them into the sector. So in terms of the magnitude of the challenge, I mean, we have looked at the Millennium Development Goals and the differences that the Sustainable Development Goals bring in. Sorry, there's a fire alarm that's just going on here. So I hope that this is not okay. It's gone away. So that information on the magnitude of the challenge, just putting in front what really the implications are for universal access in terms of targeting services, resolving issues of inequality, but also realizing that the SDGs, the indicator for the SDG brings in even a much more ambitious target by looking at safely managed services and how to achieve those. So there are a number of fundamental issues here in terms of reaching universal access, having comprehensive coverage of all subsectors throughout the entire sort of areas that are needed, and then having sustainable coverage as well, which is a significant area. And that to achieve these, it will require greater financing, but also it will require leveraging additional resources or leveraging various resources from different partners. And that might mean having discussions with finance ministers that go above and beyond just additional budget financing, but also looking into other potential contributions to the sector that could help drive progress in such an aggressive manner to actually be able to reach the SDGs by 2030. So some of the points that come out of this discussion on using existing resources better and attracting additional financing emanate from the realization that the financing gap is significant, and that what will be required to reach universal access will be a tripling of investment compared to what was required for the MDGs. So in a sense, in financial ways, in financial terms, to achieve the SDGs requires a much higher resource envelope, and approximately at the global level, this was put at $35 billion. Approximately $35 billion were invested per year to expand access between 2000 and 2015, and the total capital investments to deliver universal access to safely managed wash is estimated to be around $114 billion per year. So that shows that this is, in some cases, it could even be more than tripling of what the investments envelope was for the MDGs. Now, from this global study that was done by the World Bank, and this is Guy Hatton who worked on this while he was still at the World Bank, is that sanitation accounts for 60% of the estimated costs, including 40% for urban sanitation alone. So this just shows, or it puts the numbers in front of the sector ministers as well as the finance ministers in terms of what is really required to make the step change to achieve the SDGs. And that the sector requires additional improved revenue sources and greater efficiency in terms of utilizing resources that are already existing. So spending requirements to reach universal access are substantially higher than what was invested in the MDGs, like we've already stated, and that governments need to make decisions on how funding will be generated from a mix of tariff and taxes. So like we were talking about the 3 T's, the transfers is one area, but then there are tariffs and taxes, and that a mix of those could help to come in and begin to create the mix or the blending that is required to help close the funding gap. And the tariffs and user charges could be optimized, and taxes need to be allocated and well utilized, and that greater efficiency will then help to free up resources that then can be used in the much more in the areas that are difficult to reach, or in areas that are difficult to mobilize financing for. And that governance arrangements can impact on revenues, efficiencies, and the ability to secure additional revenues. So you see that most of this discussion is also not just is not just about the traditional sort of ministry sitting at the table, but it also goes into how utilities, for example, as huge spending agencies, how are they being more efficient, or how specific sort of programs also being efficient in areas where that's the case. So greater coordination of public finance and concessional resources can also leverage additional financing. Now, in terms of improving the operating efficiency, that is seen as the first step. This is an area where presumably ministers, sector ministers, would have a slightly larger area of authority. They can look at how existing resources are being utilized, and the efficiency in terms of how those resources are being put to use. So service providers could look at reducing costs and freeing up wasted resources. And some of the ideas in here is that maybe they could be investing more in invest in more capital efficient solutions, implement asset management systems, or reduce non-revenue water, improve collection rates, reduce energy costs, maximize reuse and resource recovery, professionalize staff, or enhance governance arrangements. So these are just some of the ideas that we're saying as countries look at their landscape. These are the potential areas where discussions can be had in terms of improving, reducing costs and freeing up resources that may not be utilized well. And hopefully that leads into an upward spiral or sustainable water sector when sort of these cost structures are looked at, and figuring out where resources could be freed up. And then the funding and financing to the sector, the sources, like we know already, are three in terms of tariffs. So the user fees for services provided and households' investment for self-supply, as well as transfers, which would come traditionally from external sources in terms of official development assistance, of foundations, NGOs, resources and remittances. All these resources that end up in the sector could come from taxes in terms of domestic taxes, from local authorities or the central government. So these are sort of the three pipes that bring resources into the water sector. Now, in terms of the first two, the tariffs and transfers, you see that here the tariff, for example, you could have some concessional financing provided by development agencies with a grant element. Or you could have private financing as well in terms of financing that would come from private resources in terms of leveraging some of these additional financing based on some of the resources that are available from some of these three financing sources. Now, looking forward, our colleagues who have done some recent research in this area are indicating that tariffs and user charges, or rather even and household contributions, seem to be an area which could be where potential exists in terms of maximizing contributions. They're also the most sustainable financing source. They suffer the least from the fluctuations that you would see, for example, from transfers, which are highly dependent on, for example, the official development assistance envelope, and if anything happens to that official development assistance envelope, the funding cycle to the wash sector can be impacted. So looking at some of the more sustainable, more stable financing sources, tariffs or user charges and household contributions seem to be part of that envelope that seems to be a bit more stable in terms of financing the sector. And then tariffs could be set to balance affordability, efficiency, and cost recovery as well. So talking about tariffs does not in itself exclude the fact of whether services are affordable or not, and should not constitute a cost barrier to access if it is well structured. And then in terms of what does not come from tariffs must come from taxes. So if it doesn't come from household contributions or user fees or user charges or tariffs, then part of that resource, some of those resources could come from taxes, which is perhaps the next level in terms of some of that stable financing. But again, in that realm, then you're already getting into fiscal implications in terms of decisions for the annual budget of financing that comes to the sector, unless those taxes are ring-fenced to specifically go towards the sector. So public funding to wash sector is definitely needed. It plays a critical role. For strong water sector governance, policy planning and budgeting monitoring, you can always there's always a reliance on sort of this public sector financing, and to invest in services with strong externalities to ensure that all society benefits, and that would be maybe using taxes to actually invest in areas that the entire public might, private contributions might not be able to invest in because of the cost, it's too expensive, or because the externality is shared across a lot of actors, and therefore it makes sense for a larger public contribution to go towards those areas and to extend services to those who need it most on equity grounds, for example, sort of deal with issues of inequalities. And the effectiveness of public taxes needs to be improved, for example, by mobilizing dedicated taxes for wash services. That could be in terms of maybe ring fencing some of the financing towards the sector, with associated revenue streams or key sector functions, for example, targeting regulation and monitoring, and the need to which need to be adequately funded, or assign taxes to public investments with greater benefit cost ratio and greater number of people saved, as well as looking at subsidies which need to be predictable, transparent, and well targeted. Now, all countries, regardless of their state of development, they need repayable financing. And so some of those sort of cost structures on capital maintenance or financial maintenance, operating and maintenance costs or investment costs, some of that financing could be tackled by repayable financing. So, for example, on capital maintenance, on financial costs and operating costs, some of that could come in, could be covered by concessional financing or commercial financing. And traditionally, the bulk of repayable finance for water came from concessional finance that's from development finance institutions with a grant element. So some of this concessional finance obviously goes to tackle the capital investments, as well as dealing with some of the operating and maintenance costs. And then to meet the SDGs, commercial finance needs to be leveraged with a particular focus on domestic commercial resources. So this is to realize that potentially in a number of countries, it's possible to look at commercial financing as well, to be able to tackle some of the capital costs that are required, as well as the maintenance costs. And in terms of the various options for private financing, and by this is not to mean privatize the sector. It just means the various range of resources that would constitute the financing that is not public and that is not transferred, say, from official development assistance, but the private financing that could include a mix of financial sources. So what we have right in front of us is just a table that helps to show the size of financing needs and potentially what makes sense in terms of the borrowing unit for the financing. So in terms of microfinance, that's most likely going to be the household that can access that financing. The vendor or supplier financing then moves into sort of larger units of communities or medium-sized enterprises or utilities. And then you've got the commercial banks or the loans or the bonds that could be accessed by utilities and municipalities. So this is to offer sort of the various sources of financing that could be looked at. So if there's a community plan to engage, or there are plans to sort of look at community services, how can some of these financing be jointly looked at, and sort of looking at what financing options would be available at what particular unit or size of sort of the unit that wants to access that financing. Now, the blending increases the private finance opportunities, and that this blending is sort of a use of a combination of some of the public finance, the free money more or less, so the grant, as well as using that to leverage additional resources. So grants and subsidies, in terms of using those for results-based subsidies to support access extension and capacity building and training and technical assistance. But then when it comes into concession or public finance, to provide liquidity to commercial finance providers and blend concessional with commercial finance to soften lending terms. So this sort of just helps to see where some of that blending could happen if a country was interested in sort of arrangements for blending. Now, this chart to a certain extent helps, and I think that it would be useful to use this chart maybe in sort of a discussion when there's an idea of what the SDG investment needs are for the sector, and then see where the potential financing sources could be. And that the starting point is to define that water SDG strategy. So what's the vision and what's the financial envelope that is required, And the costing too, you'll see that it sort of brings out these costs for capital expenditures, for operating expenditures, and maintenance costs as well. And then you've got the funding side to it. So how much of what you want to cover, of what you need, would be covered by taxes, would be covered by tariffs, and how much of that would be covered by concessional financing, and then what then is the entire funding gap that remains. And the costing too should be able to help with that type of information under that first column. The second one, which is on the cost savings from efficiency and lower operating expenses, or operating expenditures and maintenance costs, you see that once you begin to look at cost saving measures, that might help to cover the financing gap. So you would be saying, from our operating expenditures and capital expenditures, where can we save? Where can we make cost reductions? And then that can help to close the financing gap. Then there could be discussions on mobilizing domestic revenue sources. Do we raise the tariff? Or do we raise user contributions? Do we mobilize domestic taxes, which then comes in through the budget, or use catalytic loans and grants? So once that discussion happens, which is more at that taxes and tariffs structure level, if that envelope is increased to cover in the entire operating expenses, you see that then there's even more closure in terms of the financing gap. And then the fourth level of the conversation could be, how do we mobilize financing from multiple sources? And this is now where, how do we look at the mix of resources that are there to actually cover the funding gap? So one, how do we mobilize from multiple sources, including, again, the taxes, the tariffs, and the concessional financing. This is loans with low interest rates with a longer repayment period. But then how do we attract the private financing to cover the financing gap? And that is the area then where there can be more discussions in terms of what has not been financed in terms of capital expenses, and where do we get that financing domestically from domestic markets, to look at the various options that might be available. And then hopefully you'll get to the end where the entire sort of SDG target is being covered in terms of financing. So this slide, I think that it would be very helpful even when having discussions to see how to progressively sort of have that conversation on the budgeting side. And what we have at the end are just the takeaway messages in terms of what the sector ministers again need to know before they come to the meeting. The magnitude of the problem, or rather the challenge that is ahead of us, agreed politically within the SDGs, and then help the water sector to get its house in order. I think this is an area where sector ministers have got a significant responsibility. They in terms of improving the governance of the sector, but also improving on the efficiencies within the sector, and then allocating sufficient resources to the water sector by finding the appropriate mix of funding sources and developing a financing plan that uses these various mixes of resources. And it is hoped that the sector ministers could have this information so that they could even have a conversation with their finance ministers ahead of the meeting in Washington, D.C. And together they could actually look at what makes sense for that particular country. There are also messages for the finance ministers that could be utilized in terms of these discussions, which are basically, how do you incentivize the service providers to tap into domestic private finance? That's a key thing that could also come in terms of policy pronouncements from the finance ministry in terms of how to provide incentives for service providers, so then they could be able to tap into existing domestic financing. And then how do you limit the use of foreign exchange borrowing or options for leveraging domestic private finance should be explored, and also supporting the development of domestic capital markets where they're weak, and creating opportunities for prudent subnational utility borrowing, and and sort of having the conversation to get started now in terms of getting the sector ready to tap into these other existing sources. So those are the slides which would have otherwise been presented by our colleagues at the World Bank. But we're happy to kind of go through them. And again, I think there are parts of these that could really help a lot in terms of the conversations at country level. So we'll just check to see if there are questions, and if you want to take the mic, please feel free. I also know that we are past the hour mark, but the plan was to go through the substantive material, which we have done, and then to still have the conversation open for the next, say, 20 minutes or so, if people are still available. But for those that might want to leave, I think people should be able to feel free when they feel that they've had sufficient from the conversation. But then let's continue with those that would like to continue with the discussion in terms of questions. And Fiona, could you just let me know if there's a summary of the questions that we have?
Sure, Satali. I have a summary, and also if you haven't written your name, organization, where you're from, and if any others are with you in the chat, can you please do so before you sign off. So we have one question from Kamran, that in the last webinar Guy mentioned there would be more support available for country costing for specific SDG targets. Do we have any update on that? So that's...
Sorry, Fiona, would you just an update on the SDG costing tool, was it?
Yes. Or country support for the SDG costing.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so in terms of the support for using the costing tool, there's a consultant who has been hired who is working very closely with Guy Hatton at UNICEF. That consultant will be available all through to the HLM, but even post the HLM. So if you have a question on the costing tool, please do not hesitate to send that question to us, and we'll put you in touch with the consultant. At the moment, we're just sort of working as a clearinghouse so that we're able to know exactly all the questions that are coming through, but then where we can respond, we're responding, but our interest is to put you directly with the consultant. So yes, there is an update on that, and it's that there is a global help desk, as Guy is calling it. So we should be able to provide support where we can.
So we have a few questions about in the takeaway messages focused primarily on the water sector and not WASH, which has an implication for advocacy and resource mobilization. So,
oh, I see, and I think that is where the comment also came in about sanitation financing. Oh, okay, all right. So the idea, I mean, I think for urban sanitation, this would still make a lot of sense. I think in rural sanitation, maybe that is where it looks as if the message becomes a bit unclear. But I think the choice is that at the country level, it is important then to figure out which areas then maybe public financing could concentrate more. I mean, in terms of taxes or even household contributions. If the discussion is that rural financing would be done more by household contributions, then that decision has to be made there. Or that this is an area where we think that we are going to invest a bit more of the taxes because of the externality that is in there, and that's also the discussion that could be had. But I do get the point, and I think we'll mention this to our colleagues as well, that perhaps the messaging on sanitation could be much more strengthened, and as you suggest, I think that examples on sanitation could help. I think that's a very welcome idea. Thank you so much.
So we have a few requests for sharing the presentation, and then also a glossary of abbreviations used by the World Bank.
Okay.
so those are just some comments that have come in. And then from Lajana, will any of the case, or can any of the case studies include community-based financing mechanism or direct and indirect financing?
Okay, so thank you so much for that. In the input paper that I talked about earlier, I think some examples might come out in there. So we'll see when that comes out if it addresses some of the examples. But I think we take also the point that you're mentioning here, Lajana, in terms of some of the community-based financing. I think there's a question from Abi, our colleagues in Ethiopia. So glad you could take advantage of this time zone to join. And the question is, when will the costing 2 be finalized? So the costing 2, in terms of it being in a state where countries can use it, it is actually in that state right now. So feel free to start using it. And I know there was a question from Ethiopia through Abera on some of the formulas that lead to the calculations, to the outputs in the third worksheet. So the worksheets are there, but they're just not provided together with the 2 in a way that you can see them, because it's sort of the calculations that lie behind it. We'll check with our colleagues who actually are working, who have been working on the 2, that's Guy Hatton and the consultant, to see if they could be able to provide that. But it's basically the calculations that take into consideration the population numbers, the costing, the unit cost for the technology that has been selected. It looks at the baseline that you have for the SDGs, and also looks at what your target is for, if you've chosen basic or you've chosen safely managed, what the target is as well. So those worksheets were not sort of put forward just so people could have them, because they're just sort of used for calculations, but we'll check with our colleagues if they can share that. So I just took advantage to respond to that question from Abera as well. Is there a similar presentation for sanitation sector? This presentation was meant to also cover the sanitation component as well. So, for example, where there was also discussion on utility, on externalities in terms of sanitation, but in terms of also household contributions and others, that was the intention. But what I'm hearing, I think, from both Tanya and Cameron, and I think BC, if I'm not mistaken, or that might have been Batnas and maybe it was BC, is that there has to be a bit of clarity on the sanitation component in terms of how it comes across. So we'll take that feedback and then feed to our colleagues who are from the bank on this. But thank you so much for that. Okay, so Fiona, I'm sorry, I think I stepped in and looked at a few other questions.
No, that's okay. At one point they were coming in faster than I could keep track, but I think we've answered all of them. There was one comment that hygiene was also not mentioned at all in the presentation, so that's something to make note of. But I think, I'm just looking through really quickly, I think that was all of the questions.
Yes, okay. So thank you. Let me see, there's also a comment from Vietnam. We'll make an attempt to assess the cost of both urban and rural wash. However, our major focus will be more on rural wash. Okay, so thank you, Lalit, for that. That the focus will be more on rural wash. It seems very important for countries to have the SDG costing exercise and the broad financing plan, and this will require technical. Yes, in terms of technical support on the development of the, or on projecting the investment needs, yes, that's available. So I'm just reading the question from Chanda. For a comprehensive costing financing perspective in a country, would you say that the country has to look at the whole wash sector as such? able to see where gains or savings can be made, then create more fiscal space for. Yes, thank you so much for that question, Chanda. So the intention is that the costing is on the entire sector, but looking at using the costing tool. The costing tool would give information also on this on each subsector. But in terms of having this broad discussion on where efficiency gains can be made, that's also, I think, in terms of allocative efficiency. So do you want, for example, more public financing to go towards urban water, where maybe the progress to reach the SDG is much smaller, and maybe the technologies are even easier, and therefore it is easy for that financing to show easy results? Or do you want that financing to go into the much harder areas, which might be rural sanitation, for example, where there are huge gaps in terms of inequalities, and where maybe it might not even be very easy to mobilize domestic commercial financing to cover that? So these discussions, I think, have to cover the broad spectrum, so that when there are discussions in terms of allocations of resources and the potential financing sources, the idea is looking at the broader picture and seeing these allocative efficiency issues in terms of what is more efficient, what is much easier to sort of provide the best outcomes. And I think that one point that I was trying to make is that if you look at both the costing too and this discussion here now, you might see that it might be useful in the discussions to even maybe bring in colleagues from, say, utilities, or to bring in colleagues that might have a lot of information on, say, local government resource allocations, because it might be in those areas where you want to see some of these sort of allocative efficiency discussions come in. So there's a question, there's a point from Tanya. Thanks, Vitaly. Something on similar lines for rural sanitation would be welcome. I think we will circulate this presentation, so we'll just take note of people so that we can circulate the presentation now. What I seem to see in it is that, like you're saying, I think in some areas it seems to be covering mostly water. But I think parts of it are also relevant for sanitation, where particularly you've got on household contributions, and where you have the transfers as well. So I think there are parts of this that also contribute to rural sanitation, which I think might be more the question, because in terms of urban sanitation, where you have a utility covering that, this should completely be applicable. And I think, Lalit, you're raising a critical point also about the pre and post meetings, and like I said, the consultant helping on the financing tool will be available now, up to the meeting and even past the meeting as well. BC is making a point about rural financing, rural sanitation financing, which is more complex. We need to focus on this and have separate sessions for more discussion. Okay, so BC, I think what we would do is we have taken this feedback, and then what we can also do is arrange a follow-up discussion with Bangladesh. And Lalit, I saw that you said it would be good to have a private Skype conversation. So we could arrange also a separate follow-up discussion, and those that might want that to happen, please always feel free to let us know. We can arrange a follow-up discussion to discuss how this contributes a lot to rural financing, rural sanitation financing, as well as hygiene, which, I mean, sometimes you have that sort of covered within Ministry of Health, if that's where it is, but also it's a software cost in some cases. So does that come in under sort of the operating and maintenance costs, or the recurrent costs that are required sort of do the software component of the sector? So let's work on having this follow-up conversation with colleagues in Bangladesh and Vietnam, and also others that might want that to happen. We're very open to doing that in the coming week or so. Just checking to see if there's any other comment. And feel free to ask. It could be about the preparatory process. It could be about the actual content in terms of the financing part. So if there's any question that people had on the guidance note, we'll be happy to cover that as well. Okay, thank you so much, Lalit, and we will follow up on the idea of doing a call with Vietnam, and we'll just check with also colleagues that are on the call, like BC, whether there have been any discussions so far with the colleagues from the government in terms of the materials that have been sent. So it would be good if you're able to maybe do you can even do a follow-up email to that. Is UNICEF supporting the countries for necessary preparations for SMM, HLM? So Lajana, that's a great question. What we are doing is that we have this global process led by the Secretariat, but also partners in various countries. We've requested them to see if they can support the process. So I believe in Nepal, you could have discussions with UNICEF as well to see what they are putting forward in terms of support to the preparations. But that we know for sure is happening in a number of countries in terms of partners coming together to help. And where that is not very clear, please let us know so that we can discuss. Okay, thank you. So just to thank also those that are giving feedback in terms of the discussions that are going on at country level. And thanks, thanks Lalit, BC, and Charlotte. I'd like to follow up. Okay, so Charlotte, in terms of how how you could support the process, maybe we could actually even arrange a call, and since you are just about 3 hours or so behind us, we could arrange that at some point tomorrow or Wednesday, but we'll follow up with that. Peter, thank you for the feedback. Okay, so Peter, in terms of the costing, the SDGs costing, so we take that as a request for support. So we will link you with Guy Hatton and our colleague, the consultant. So just to let you know that we're taking this as a request for that additional support on the costing too. And like I said, we could still do a bilateral with each of the countries. So Peter, we can actually arrange a call with you and colleagues there and go through the slides, go through the template, and that should be okay. I was in Zambia and Zimbabwe a few weeks ago, and we were able to test it, and it was quite interesting in terms of the starting points and some of the key areas, of which sort of the baseline on the SDGs was quite a critical trigger point of the discussion and an area in terms of starting point of working on the two. So Peter, we'll take note of that request for South Sudan. BC, thank you for that update, and on the discussion in Bangladesh. Rashid, thank you so much. We will send the presentation definitely. Thank you, Govind, and thank you, Lajana. Okay, so thank you. It looks like people are logging out. So just to say that I think we've covered substantively what we needed to cover, and so those of you that would like to continue the conversation, please stay on. We should be closing maybe in about 6 minutes, but those that would like to go to attend to other business, please feel free. If you haven't typed your name in the chat, please do that and let us know where you joined the call from. So it would be great if you could type your name and location in the chat. And BC, while you're still there, do you know whether any of the government colleagues were able to join the call today, maybe with you or independently? Thanks, Sonam. And yes, we understood about Mr. Richard not being able to join, but we're glad you could join. And Sonam, let us know if we can arrange a bilateral with you and Mr. Richard for Bhutan. And if Cameron is still there, I'm sure that's one place that would be happy to also have Cameron join the call as well. But do let us know if you and the government colleague would be happy to do a bilateral for Bhutan, so we can go through some of these materials, but also just talk about the preparatory process. Oh, BC, I see you're on leave actually, but thank you so much for joining, and let us know when you're back, then we can follow that up. Dr. Saima Shafiq, thank you for joining as well today, and we hope this is helpful in terms of the discussions that you're having at country level in reaching out to ministers in terms of the preparatory process. Do let us know if you would want us to also arrange a bilateral at some point, but I know you're working also with colleagues there on that. So now we will follow up on that, on the possibility of doing a call. Thank you. Tanya, I think we actually still have Dr. Saima Shafiq from the Ministry of Climate Change in Pakistan. So she was able to join. I think she's just left now. I think she's still there. So I think we did have government colleagues from Pakistan. Dr. Shafiq, could you just confirm whether you were alone or you were with other colleagues from the government? You could even speak if you wanted to. Let me just unmute you. So were you able to join with colleagues or not?
No. Hello, Sitali.
Hi. Hello.
Hello. How are you?
Very well, thank you.
No, I was alone from Ministry of Climate Change. Irfan Tariq Sahab was busy in some other business and assignment. So I'm the only one who has joined, but I will update him regarding the webinar and what we have discussed.
Okay, thank you so much. And what's the picture like for now in terms of say discussions with the ministers, and are there indications in terms of their coming to the meeting?
Yeah, currently we have moved the summary for this participation, but we will be requiring the invitation letters as well. So we have requested the Secretariat to please issue the invitation letters on the name of Minister, because that is the requirement. So so far we have updated them, and we have sent the nominations of respective ministers to Secretariat as well.
Yeah, all right. Thank you so much for that. And I mean, I think it's good news that the dates for the sector ministers meeting are now set, which enables UNICEF to go ahead with sending the invitations to sector ministers, and those invitations are following the save the date letter which was sent by Mr. Rudd. So we hope that in the coming weeks or so, those letters should be able to reach you for transmittal to the ministers.
Sure, that will be a great help, because otherwise we will not be able to secure the time, ministers' time, though we have informed ministers, but the invitation letters are the prerequisite.
You're right. You're right. Okay. Now, I'm sure our colleagues will be working hard on that. I think that the processes just takes a bit of some days or weeks, but that now that we have the go ahead, they should be working on that, on the invitations in the coming weeks or so.
Sure. Thank you.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Peter, I see you're typing something. If you wanted to speak into the mic, if you have one there, you can go ahead. Yes, so that question about the ministers who received the save the date, to confirm, yes, it would be, we're really keen to see that finance ministers also confirm their participation.
Okay, Sital, I think we will do that because they have already received the save the date, and we officially submitted through our minister. The minister submitted officially to the Minister of Finance officially.
Okay.
And then later on, whether there is a need for them to confirm or not, you can let us know. They can also do their confirmation.
Okay. Okay, that's really good. So we'll be looking forward to hearing from your team on that confirmation. And then, Peter, like we were saying about the costing too, I think we can follow up independently on that to be able to provide the support that is required. But we do have a global help desk, which is remote nonetheless, but it's meant to help provide the support. Thank you.
Thank you, Sitale. We tried to look at what has been costed by the global, but it was complicated. So we had wanted to get some clarification on it. That is why we said there is a need for the technical support.
Okay.
There were some issues that we had wanted to get it clear. It was already given some kind of tentative costing. It was done for South Sudan.
Yes.
So there are some things that we need to get it clear.
Okay. Okay, no, that's okay, and we would definitely follow up with Guy Hatton on that. We had a call with Nigeria last week, if this insight might help, and one of the questions they had, because they were using the costing tool, is that the numbers they found in there on the baseline were not consistent with the JMP 2015, and the response to that was simply that. The JMP 2015 used the indicators that they used were the MDG indicators, which had improved access and not basic or safely managed. So improved would now fit parts of basic or safely managed in the new JMP ladder. So if you're looking at the JMP ladder, that's the information in the costing tool would somewhat link more with the JMP ladder, with the SDG indicator. So if you find that there's some inconsistencies in terms of the baseline, it's because that information in the costing tool for now is based on the SDG indicator and not on the MDG indicator. And in any case, that information in the tool was put in there around 2015 or so. So within the last year or so, and with the new baseline information, it might be that maybe there are a few changes here and there. And so the new SDG baseline estimates should be able to resolve that. But we will definitely put you in touch with Guy Hatton and colleagues on sort of having a substantive discussion on how to use the tool. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. So I'm not sure we have any more questions. If not, I think we will call it a day. And just to thank everyone once again, this has been very good having all of you join the webinar. We will send the PowerPoint presentation, and we should be able to follow up with those that we've indicated here in terms of a bilateral discussion. We should be able to follow up that. But thank you very much, and do have a fruitful day. Thank you.